Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
Welcome to another episode of the All Out Leadership Podcast. We are looking at the life of David and what made him the gold standard of leadership by which God measured every other king in the nation of Israel. We know that David is famous for being the Goliath, the giant killer. We all want to be like David. We want to be the one that kills that giant problem, launches that giant product, and has great success. But what we often fail to see are the little principles, the daily application of principles that positioned them ultimately to become a great leader. That's what we've been looking at the life of David. We saw that first David knew how to show up on time and at the right place. We saw that David was faithful in little things. He was a good steward of what God had trusted him because he could be good at little. God could trust him with much. Last week we saw that submission put David right on God's mission, that when we know how to submit to the leaders that God has placed inside of our life or the mandate that God has placed to us, submission always keeps us in the middle of God's mission. And we're going to pick up with principle number 4. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 32. David has seen Goliath. He's upset that this giant would come and mock his people, the people of Israel, and his God. And so he's brought before King Saul, where he says this statement to King Saul regarding this problem that Israel has. In verse 32 of 17, then David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant," keyword servant, "will go and fight this Philistine." In other words, hey, you got a problem, I'm your huckleberry, and I'm going to go fight this for you. We see that David was a servant leader. Now, that's kind of a sexy word. We hear that a lot. It's kind of sexy, whether it's in secular leadership or church leadership. Servant leadership. You know, what is servant leadership? I like this definition. You know you're a servant by how you react when you're treated like one. The way you truly know that your heart is a servant to others, a servant to God, is by how you react when someone treat you like a servant. Servants aren't always respected. A servant isn't necessarily given the credit. A servant isn't, necessarily 9 to 5. They don't necessarily get the employee of the month. And how you react when life doesn't seem to be fair, your boss doesn't seem to be fair, the raise didn't seem to be fair, the promotion didn't seem to be fair, really determines whether or not you are genuinely positioned inside of your heart as a servant leader. Now, a lot of people go, well, man, I'm a great leader because I've read a lot of great books. And I do believe the importance of study and personal development. We know the statement, leaders are readers. Leaders should always be learning, always be growing. But don't confuse information with transformation. That just because you've read 100 books on leadership doesn't mean you've applied the 100 books to leadership. We can study servant leadership, but it doesn't mean we've applied and become servant leaders. I like the illustration that was from a television show many years ago. There was a TV host who was interviewing a panel of professional bodybuilders. They were just huge and ripped, and they came all greased up as if they were actually performing for a competition, and they're sitting there just muscles spread out. And that host asked them this interesting question, and he goes, you got all these muscles, they're huge, but what are all those muscles for? What do you do with all those muscles? And then this one guy stood up and he begins to flex and just do all these really cool lat spray and bicep poses. And the studio audience is clapping and cheering, woo, and they're just going nuts. And then he sits back down, and then the host goes, hey, that's great, that's impressive, but let me ask you again, what do you do with all those muscles? Then the guy stands up and does different poses. And again, the audience cheers and screams and claps. And then he sits back down and the guy asks the question again. That's great, but what do you do with all those muscles? The bodybuilder just never got it. He had all these muscles, and he just thought they were for showing off. And he didn't understand that the purpose of muscles is to lift weights, to help lift the burdens of others. It's not how much you know, but how much you apply of what you know to help and improve other people's life. And that's really what it means to be a servant leader. Yeah, we're learning and we're growing, but all of that is to be designed that we can help lift the load on other people's backs, how we can come alongside and lift and carry one another's burdens. In fact, I believe that's a Bible verse, bearing one another's burdens. And so from this passage from the life of David, there's three things I want to highlight that are really the marks of a certain servant leader. Now, there's more. This isn't all encompassing, but three things I want to highlight that I think stand out about David as a servant leader. Number one, you are a servant when you do what no one else wants to do. See, it's not enough that, you got this really awesome opportunity and your boss goes, I need somebody to go to the Grand Cayman Islands and get that new sales contract. And you go, oh, I'm a servant, I'll go. Yeah, no, that's not really servanthood to go sit on a beach sipping virgin pina coladas and trying to do a sales deal. That's not what we're talking about. Servant leadership is when he goes, or she goes, hey, the toilets are overflowing, or we got some, we need somebody to work a little extra over here and nobody else wants it. And you're the one who goes, I'll do that. Genuine servant leadership is taking the job and doing the task nobody else wants to do. I remember this early in my ministry days when I started out as a volunteer youth leader. I was 19. I started in Bible college, and I volunteered inside of our church, and I did everything I could get my hands on. And there were several student youth leaders that were the same age as me. They were first year or second year college students, and they were given all the really cool, sexy, so to speak, opportunities. They got to, lead worship. They got to perform dramas. They got to take up the offering and prepare a message, or they even got to speak sometime. And the youth pastor goes, Eric, I need you to set up chairs. Now, that's not very glamorous. And that was honestly the leftover that nobody else wanted. And I said, you know what? I'll do that. And I just purposed it in my heart. I said, God, I'm going to be the greatest chair straightener upper. Not sure that's a word, but I just made it up. The greatest chair straightener upper you've ever had. And I'm going to be so good that angels look down from heaven and go, who is this guy? He is the Michelangelo of straightening up chairs. And I just started out being faithful at straightening up chairs. And I truly just did that as unto the Lord. And a man's gift makes room for them. So man, woman, whatever you're doing right now, if you'll just continue to be faithful and serve, taking those tasks maybe nobody else wants, know this, it won't be long before your gifts make room for you. Here's what happened. I actually ended up outlasting all the other leaders because I was faithful, I was consistent, and they began to be inconsistent because new, glamorous, and sexy, that wears off. So because they only wanted to do what was cool, they did it for the wrong reasons. And when the newness wore off, they became to drift. And so I was the one who got to fill in when they didn't show up. And ultimately, I became the go-to guy, not the leftover guy. And I actually got promoted by default because I just outlasted everybody else because I was the guy willing to do whatever it takes, whenever it takes. And that's how I got promoted in ministry. The second aspect of a servant leader is this. You prefer the needs of the team above your own. Notice what motivated David was not personal gain here. What motivated David is let no man's heart fail because of him. He saw how this was impacting his people, his team, his God, and he took that personally. Do you take the reputation of your company, your business, your boss, your team, do you take that personally? And so think about team. It's team. Okay. So I love this Philippians chapter 2, verse 3. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. Let each look out not only for our own interests, but also for the interests of others. It's one thing to be great at what you do with your team if you're leading a team, but it's a whole nother thing to see the big picture. Now, if you're working for a pastor, you're working for a boss, know this, they have to see the 30,000 foot. They have to see everything. We tend to see our silo. We tend to see our own lane. But what makes a team member the most valuable isn't just that they're good at what they do, but they think we, not just me or just my. They think thy. They think of the whole. Remember, thy kingdom come, not my kingdom come. Think of the we. The third thing is this. You're a servant leader when you risk something for the benefit of the greater good. The question is this, what are you willing to risk? What cost are you willing to pay for the good of the team? Great leaders bring sacrifice to what they do. And I find this interesting. David took the job that nobody wanted, and if he failed, it would have cost him his life. What was the last thing you really risked? What was the last thing you really put on the line in terms of going all out as a team player? Philippians chapter 2, verse 5, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant and coming in the likeness of men, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself, became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. It's not just what you're willing to live for the team, but what you're willing to die for the team. Don't just tell me as a leader what you're willing to live for, but tell me what you're willing to give up for the good of the whole, because you have to give up to go up. And what we find is life is always found on the other side of somebody having died to something. Jesus died so that we might live. Somebody laid something down so that we might enjoy freedom. In America, we enjoy our freedom because there were people who sacrificed for that. And so these are 3 attributes that make a great servant leader. We look forward to seeing you next week as we continue on the life of David.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at ericlawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.